Welcome everyone to our UCL Medical Anthropology Vaccines in View seminar series. My name's Sarah Gibbon, and along with my colleagues here in the department at UCL, David Napier, Joe Cook, Aaron Parkhurst and Rebecca Irons. I'm one of the co-organisers for the series and the chair for this, our first seminar. This seminar series comes from a shared conviction, I think, that anthropology has much to contribute to our understanding of and intervention on the unfolding global COVID-19 pandemic. Over the last year, anthropologists across a range of international contexts have been living with and critically reflecting upon the pandemic, including in our UCL Medical Anthropology blog series, tracking the diverse responses, experiences and perspectives, and revealing the uneven and dynamic context of the pandemic and efforts to mitigate and control its effects. So in this series, we hone in on a very immediate and contemporary moment in the evolution of the pandemic, where we see on the one hand, the global rollout of the vaccines, and on the other, the stark reality of the collective failure to do that in others. A situation that reflects the extent to which global biopolitics, geopolitics, conspiracies, public trust, nationalism, social inequalities, and public health are very much at stake. So the 7 talks we've brought together here for this series engage in diverse ways with these themes and many others. And collectively, we hope they bring critical, engaged, and reflective thinking and analysis to our unfolding anthropological knowledge and understandings of the emerging terrain of vaccines and vaccination. So we're truly excited and delighted to have this opportunity to present the work of these speakers and share their knowledge and ideas on this platform in efforts to understand, engage, and grapple with the shared and lived realities of this evolving moment of the COVID-19 pandemic. So before introducing today's speaker, I just want to highlight a few practical issues concerning the format of the seminars and how they'll operate on this Zoom webinar platform. So your camera and mic, as you've noted, are muted during the seminar, but you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of the speaker via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You'll see the raised hand option, but we're only fielding questions by the Q&A function. You can type your question into the Q&A forum at any point in the seminar anonymously, if you wish, and all the questions can be voted for at any point in the seminar using the thumbs up icon. So the speaker will be asked to respond to those questions that have been given the most votes. Questions also that are similar will be moderated to ensure that a range of topics are addressed. So in this way, we hope to have as democratic and a participatory a discussion as possible within the limitations of this virtual webinar platform. I should also add that we've created a forum on our UCL Medical Anthropology blog page that will be open for further post-seminar commentary after the completion of the seminar today for an hour. And the link to this forum will be circulated to you by email before the end of the seminar. But to move swiftly to the main business, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the Vaccines in View seminar series, Andrew Lakoff, who could not be a more appropriate person to launch this set of talks. I'm delighted to have him here with us today. So Andrew Lakoff was trained as a cultural anthropologist of science and medicine. He is currently professor of sociology at the University of Southern California, where he also directs the Center on Science, Technology and Public Life. His books include Pharmaceutical Reason, Knowledge and Value in Global Psychiatry, published by Cambridge University Press in 2006. Unprepared, Global Health in a Time of Emergency, published by California University Press in 2017, and forthcoming this year, The Government of Emergency, Vital Systems, Expertise and the Politics of Security, published by Princeton University Press and co-authored with Stephen Collier. His talk today is entitled A Regulatory State of Exception, Vaccines and the Politics of Expertise in the COVID Emergency. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction, and thanks to you and the other organizers for putting together this series and for the invitation. So this is obviously a topic about which we need to hear perspectives from around the world on what's very far from a singular story. I'm going to share a particular viewpoint, looking at the intersection of public trust, vaccine hesitancy, and the politics of expertise in the context of emergency. My talk focuses on the US, but I'm hoping that it will have some resonance with parallel issues unfolding in other settings. To begin, in the summer 2020, the long simmering crisis in the public role of expert knowledge in the United States seemed to reach a boiling point. The rapid and deadly spread of the novel coronavirus over the prior months coincided with a bitterly fought presidential campaign. In its response to the pandemic, the Trump administration had thrown into question the very premise that the claims of technical experts should or could be considered independently of political calculation. Respected government health institutions, such as the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health, were sidelined from management of the crisis, their experts' recommendations ignored or overruled. Representatives of what the president derisively referred to as the deep state were inherently suspect. Urgent health policy questions remained unsettled and even became sources of public unrest. Should government require masks in public places? How should states determine epidemiological thresholds for the closure of schools? Should doctors be allowed to prescribe highly touted but unproven medications? Regulatory science had perhaps never been so explicitly politicized. It was in this fraught context that attention turned to the question of how soon a vaccine to contain the pandemic would be made available. As the date of the election neared, the president staked his claim to having adequately responded to the pandemic on the premise that the government's vaccine development program would deliver a technical fix by the fall. Indeed, it seemed possible that the fate of the republic would hinge upon the timing of an ostensibly technical decision, the regulatory authorization of a COVID vaccine. In this talk, I'll examine how, at this critical moment, key actors defended the autonomy of the regulatory process. As we'll see, an alliance of academic scientists, federal agency staff, and drug industry leaders drew upon the specter of vaccine hesitancy to fend off political interference. While trust in the safety of technical objects such as vaccines is often seen to depend on the autonomy of regulatory agencies and the objectivity of experts, here I want to show that the converse was the case. Experts and regulatory officials use the construct of public trust, or rather mistrust, as a means to preserve their autonomy. First slide, please, or next slide. In April 2020, the Trump administration introduced Operation Warp Speed, an ambitious effort to speed up the development, production, and distribution of vaccines to address the pandemic emergency. The program contracted with several pharmaceutical and biotech companies to support vaccine research and development with an initial $10 billion budget. The timeframe it envisioned was audacious in comparison with the prior history of vaccine development. It sought to deliver 300 million doses of safe and effective COVID vaccines by the beginning of 2021. While a typical vaccine development process could take 6 years or more to complete, Operation Warp Speed sought to reduce the timeline to roughly 1 year through a series of efficiency measures, including an expedited regulatory evaluation process. By the summer 2020, the program seemed on the verge of success as several of its candidates had already entered phase 3 trials. Accelerating the regulatory review process was a critical element of the Warp Speed strategy. Under normal circumstances, a vaccine candidate must go through a lengthy biologics license application before the US Food and Drug Administration will approve it for entrance onto the market. The review includes a detailed benefit risk analysis conducted by FDA regulators based on a comprehensive evaluation of clinical trial data provided by the vaccine developer. This standardized procedure provides a form of what Ted Porter calls mechanical objectivity, protecting the agency against accusations of bias or mistaken judgment. Strict adherence to such protocols, it is surmised, ensures public confidence in the integrity of the agency's decisions. However, in the context of a deadly pandemic with no available pharmaceutical interventions, vaccine developers anticipated the need for an alternative to the normal regulatory process. The Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA procedure, enables the temporary use of an unapproved medical product if a public health emergency has been declared, and if available evidence indicates that it is reasonable to believe that the product in question may be effective in treating the condition identified by the emergency declaration. The EUA thus provides the federal government with a flexible method for the rapid authorization of an unapproved medicine in the urgent circumstances of a public health emergency. However, the very flexibility of the EUA procedure opens it up to the danger of the perception of external influence. by attenuating the lengthy process used to generate mechanical objectivity, the issuance of such an authorization may be seen to compromise the integrity of a regulatory decision. The EUA mechanism draws on a different form of governmental rationality than the normal procedures of drug regulation, a form of rationality taken up from the world of national security. In contrast to the world of public health, in which evidence of safety and efficacy is compiled through statistical analysis of clinical trial data, the EUA addresses a future event whose onset is unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. Next slide. The device was first introduced in the context of US bioterrorism preparedness initiatives in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Biodefense officials had assembled a strategic national stockpile of medical supplies as a means of anticipating a potential bioterrorist attack. The stockpile contained troves of countermeasures such as smallpox and anthrax vaccine, nerve gas antidote, and antitoxins, many of which did not have FDA approval for these uses, and indeed could not be tested on humans since the diseases in question were not present in the population. This became a problem in the immediate aftermath of the 2001 anthrax letters, during which the lack of regulatory authorization made it difficult to provide a post-exposure anthrax vaccine to postal workers. In turn, national security officials worried that in a future biological emergency, such as a smallpox attack, in which there was an urgent need for mass treatment but no approved countermeasure, there would not be enough time for a prospective drug or vaccine to go through the regulatory approval process. Congress sought to address this gap in preparedness as part of the 2004 Project Bioshield Act, which included a provision that would expedite the use of a potentially life-saving countermeasure in the event of a mass casualty attack. Upon the declaration of a public health emergency affecting national security, EUA authority allows the FDA to facilitate availability and unapproved uses of potential treatments. This procedure was first used the following year to enable the military to immunize soldiers against anthrax using an unapproved vaccine. Next slide, please. In 2006, new legislation enacted in response to the threat of avian flu extended the framework of biological preparedness beyond the scenario of a bioterrorist attack to emerging diseases such as pandemic influenza. The legislation provided FDA with criteria for evaluating an emergency use application. The disease must be life-threatening. It must be reasonable to believe the product may be effective. The known and unknown benefits of the medicine must outweigh its potential risks, and there must be no available alternative. The mechanism built in flexibility to allow for the exigencies of an as yet unknown future situation. FDA would decide on a case-by-case basis what kinds of evidence concerning safety and efficacy would be needed, and what method would be used to calculate the ratio of benefit to risk. For instance, a vaccine that would be given to millions of healthy people would presumably have to reach a different threshold in a benefit-risk analysis than a potentially life-saving drug intended for an infected patient. The EUA device is distinct from normal procedures of regulatory assessment in that it participates in the logic of emergency government. Here it's useful to contrast the distinctive form of American emergency government devised in the mid-century context of Cold War mobilization with the state of exception famously envisioned by Carl Schmitt, in which constitutional order is suspended in favor of unimpeded sovereign decision. The US system for governing emergencies provides statutory authority in advance of an anticipated crisis for the temporary implementation of pre-formulated emergency measures. Thus, as part of Project Bioshield, the EUA device was developed based on the scenario of a future catastrophic event, such as a bioterrorist attack or a pandemic, in which the urgency of the situation would require an alternative to the standard regulatory process. In the case of such an event, the normal requirement for comprehensive review of clinical trial data could be suspended in order to enable response to the exigencies of a rapidly unfolding situation. The EUA establishes a space of regulatory ambiguity. It will be up for negotiation and contestation how an authorization for emergency use may be granted. In the case of the COVID vaccine, as we will see, an unintended consequence of this interpretive leeway was the opening up of the regulatory process to what some observers considered dangerous external pressure. Next slide, please. On February 4th, 2020, 2 weeks after the initial detection of the novel coronavirus in the US, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar declared the event a public health emergency that has significant potential to affect national security. On this basis, the Secretary determined that circumstances exist justifying the authorization of medical treatments not approved by FDA. Over the next several months, the agency drew upon the EUA mechanism to authorize the temporary use of a number of unapproved medical products. The issuance of an emergency authorization to allow the prescription of hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID in April proved controversial. The drug's efficacy was still under investigation at the time, but it had been promoted as a wonder drug by a number of public figures, including President Trump. After several studies failed to demonstrate its efficacy and indeed suggested possible harm, FDA withdrew its authorization in June. The application of the EUA device again sparked controversy in late August, when FDA Commissioner Hahn, in this image, appeared at a press conference alongside President Trump and Secretary Azar to tout the success of convalescent plasma therapy in treating severe cases of COVID, and to announce that FDA had issued an emergency authorization for its clinical use. Soon after the announcement, a number of scientists outside of government sharply criticized the FDA commissioner for making exaggerated claims about the treatment's efficacy. As Eric Topol, editor of Medline, wrote in an open letter, "We cannot entrust the health of 330 million Americans to a person who is subservient to President Trump's whims, unprecedented promotion of unproven therapies, outrageous lies, and political motivations." Even more troubling for many observers was the possibility that the administration would use the EUA mechanism to prematurely authorize the use of a COVID vaccine. Indeed, this was a more or less explicit strategy of the Trump campaign, which hoped to counter widespread criticism of the administration's handling of the pandemic by taking credit for a rapid vaccine rollout. Campaign advisors described pre-election vaccine approval as the Holy Grail. The scenario of such an October surprise vaccine became more plausible with the announcement by Pfizer's CEO that a conclusive readout of clinical trial results for its candidate vaccine would be available by the end of October, after which the company would immediately file an application with the FDA for an emergency use authorization. Next slide, please. In this context, a number of scientists made public statements questioning the integrity of the EUA process. The editor-in-chief of Science magazine published a scathing editorial assailing the administration's health agencies for bowing to political pressure and calling on doctors to refuse to administer any vaccine authorized under questionable circumstances. In his letter, Topol called on the FDA commissioner to either pledge to conduct a rigorous vaccine assessment process or immediately resign. He argued that already fragile public confidence in vaccines must be shored up by demonstrating the autonomy of the regulatory process from influence by the Trump administration. From within the government, a group of senior FDA officials also linked the credibility of the agency's regulatory decisions to its insulation from political interference. When it comes to decisions to authorize or approve the products we regulate, they argued in an op-ed, we and our career staff do the best by public health when we are the decision makers. The stakes of preserving expert autonomy for public health were high, the officials warned. If the agency's credibility is lost, they wrote, because of real or perceived interference, people will not rely on the agency's safety warnings. Next slide, please. Biotech leaders joined the chorus of opposition to political meddling in regulatory decisions. In an open letter to the biopharmaceutical industry, the industry advocacy organization BIO wrote that FDA should maintain its historic independence as the gold standard international regulatory body, free from external influence. Again, the preservation of public trust and expertise served as the rationale for regulatory autonomy. Thus, an alliance had formed among academic scientists, government regulators, and drug industry leaders to protect the vaccine authorization process from a perception of political interference. The assumption was that the success of a vaccination program would hinge not only on the therapeutic efficacy of a vaccine as demonstrated in clinical trials, but also on public confidence in the integrity of the regulatory enterprise. Here, the specter of vaccine hesitancy loomed. If a significant proportion of the population refused to take the vaccine, especially given uncertainty about the degree of therapeutic efficacy that an eventual vaccine would demonstrate, a mass vaccination program might well fail to stem the pandemic. Next slide, please. In parallel to and interaction with experts' defense of regulatory autonomy, a number of surveys reported decreasing public confidence in the regulatory process and decreasing willingness to take a prospective COVID vaccine. Between May and September 2020, according to the Pew Research Center, the number of respondents who would either definitely or probably take an available vaccine declined from 72% to 51%, with over 3/4 of respondents indicating that a vaccine would likely be approved before its safety and efficacy had been comprehensively assessed. A group of former FDA commissioners cited the finding of another poll that 42% of Americans lacked trust in FDA decision-making. The implications of such survey data were potentially dire, they argued, for addressing the day's most urgent question. When the FDA approves a COVID-19 vaccine, will Americans accept it? As critical social scientists, we should be cautious in interpreting the significance of these measures of public trust in a COVID vaccine. Trust in regulatory science, as Gil et al. Notes, is not best understood as an attitude that can be measured by surveys, but is rather a byproduct of institutional mechanisms embedded in social arrangements. Trust can either easily swing into distrust and then back again. It is a moving target shifting with the winds, he writes, sensitive to recent events or to how a question is formulated. In this case, political winds may have been shaping public response to survey questions. Next slide, please. In the context of a polarizing election campaign in which one's position with respect to the administration's management of vaccine development could well depend on one's political self-identity, survey responses did not necessarily indicate what a given member of the public was likely to actually do when faced with the concrete situation of an available FDA-authorized vaccine. For my purposes here, however, the question is not so much whether these surveys accurately measured a coherent entity, public trust, nor how to explain an apparent decline in levels of trust. Rather, what is of interest is how such measures of declining public trust were marshaled as a resource by scientists and regulatory officials who sought to insulate the FDA from external political pressure. The prospect of vaccine hesitancy under these circumstances changed its normative valence. For over 2 decades, scientists and public health specialists have considered vaccine hesitancy as a problem demonstrating the need for improved public understanding of science. That is, as a problem of irrational fear sparked by rumor and misinformation, a deficit requiring correction. The task for experts and officials, in turn, has been to use the tools of risk communication, such as transparency, openness, engagement, to assuage irrational public fear. But in the late summer and early fall 2020, as the pandemic emergency intensified and the election approached, the relation of scientific authority to public distrust shifted. The specter of vaccine hesitancy became a resource to defend regulatory autonomy rather than a target for correction. In September 2020, 2 companies with promising vaccine candidates, Pfizer and Moderna, indicated that preliminary results from their clinical trials might be available as early as the following month. Each company had already produced millions of vaccine doses in anticipation of rapid authorization for distribution. In order to prepare their applications for an EUA issuance, the companies requested guidance from the FDA on how the agency planned to make a decision on granting emergency authorization for a novel vaccine candidate. Meanwhile, a bureaucratic struggle was brewing between FDA career scientists on the one hand and White House officials on the other over how vaccine candidates would be evaluated as the results of vaccine developers' phase 3 clinical trials came in. FDA Director Hahn, stung by criticism of the EUA process from respected scientists, insisted that the agency would use stringent criteria for authorization and would subject all vaccine candidates to assessment by an external body of experts. Next slide, please. FDA staff drew up a set of proposed guidelines for vaccine developers that would help provide adequate information to assess a vaccine's benefit-risk profile. In a public statement, the agency's lead vaccine evaluator emphasized that increasing trust in vaccines was the rationale for these new requirements. The guidelines sought to emulate, within a circumscribed timeframe, the kind of regulatory scrutiny that a normal biologics license application would require. The effort was to at least partially reconstruct the mechanical objectivity of a standard benefit-risk analysis in order to demonstrate the agency's integrity. Two of the proposed guidelines were of particular note. First, clinical trial subjects would have to be tracked for at least 2 months for potential adverse reactions. And second, a minimum number of severe COVID cases would have to be included in the control group numbers. It was not lost on White House officials that the adoption of these guidelines would extend the timeline for EUA evaluation beyond the date of the election. According to President Trump, the regulatory requirements were, quote, a political move more than anything else. And the president's chief of staff complained about new guidance that came out just a few weeks before we're hopefully going to have some very good results on 3 clinical trials from some of these vaccines. By early October, it was reported that the White House would likely block the proposed guidelines. At this moment of intensifying struggle within the executive branch, a number of external authorities weighed in to support FDA autonomy in determining the EUA evaluation procedures, again invoking the need to secure public trust in regulatory authority. If the White House takes the unprecedented step of trying to tip the scales on how safety and benefits will be judged, wrote the group of FDA commissioners, the impact on public trust will render an effective vaccine much less so. In an open letter to Secretary Azar, the president of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization insisted that new FDA guidance should be finalized and communicated with those on the front lines developing potential vaccines, and must also be shared more broadly with the American public. Alluding to the fragility of public trust, he continued, "We cannot allow a lack of transparency to undermine confidence in the vaccine development process." At this stage, with a high-stakes meeting of the agency's External Advisory Committee on Vaccines scheduled shortly to discuss the review process, FDA officials performed what the editor of Science called bureaucratic jujitsu. They stealthily inserted the new guidelines into briefing materials that were posted online for participants in advance of the advisory committee meeting. As the date of the meeting approached, perhaps because they were now publicly available, the White House did not, in the end, block the proposed guidelines. With the new guidelines in place, it would now be practically impossible for any of the vaccine candidates to receive authorization before the election. FDA scientists celebrated the online appearance of the new guidelines, reported the New York Times, which called the event a win for career civil servants. Meanwhile, President Trump dismissed the outcome as another political hit job, making it more difficult for them to speed up vaccines for approval before Election Day. To conclude, the public health emergency of the coronavirus pandemic generated an experiment in the provisional reconstruction of a regulatory process designed to ensure public trust in technical objects like vaccines. The construct of public trust and the specter of vaccine hesitancy, wielded by an alliance of academic scientists, industry leaders, and government regulators, enabled the FDA to fend off external interference and sustain the perceived integrity of the vaccine authorization process. What occasioned this struggle, we have seen, was the distinctive bureaucratic space in which the evaluation of COVID vaccine candidates took place. In response to the pandemic emergency, the federal government had created a state of regulatory exception in which the emergency use authorization was a tool that enabled it potentially to curtail the normal approval process. As a preparedness device, the EUA had been put in place with a specific scenario in mind, in which there would be no time to perform a normal evaluation of the safety and efficacy of a medical countermeasure to address a public health emergency. The structure of a future crisis situation had been envisioned in advance. What had not been envisioned was the potential for abuse of the EUA procedure. The emergency use authorization made it possible for external political influence to shape an ad hoc regulatory decision. In this context, US regulatory agencies and medical experts sought to fend off such interference at a moment of intense political pressure by invoking the need to preserve public trust as a way to ensure the efficacy of a mass vaccination campaign. Next slide. Let me end with a coda. While the alliance I've described was effective in staving off an October vaccine surprise, it did not manage to depoliticize the question of vaccine safety and efficacy. Indeed, it might be argued that the very effort to hive regulatory expertise off from politics was itself a political position. In any case, it seems, at least in the United States, that we remain stuck in a situation in which political self-identity shapes trust in the authority of expertise. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that really rich and very thoughtful reflections on the sort of specificity of the US context in many ways, although I think this question of regulatory exception plays out in other contexts as well that you might comment on in the discussion too, thinking China and Russia and the European context as being different perhaps as well is another dimension. But we do have questions lining up, and the format for this seminar is that people are able to ask questions on the Q&A and to vote for them as well. And I'm just having a look now, and we have a number coming in. So I will move to the top of one at the top of the list, actually. The question is not anonymous, it's from Stephen Hinchliffe. The question is, can you comment on the economic and market relations in the EUAs, particularly the role of pre-purchase agreements and other forms of state-pharma contractual relations?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I guess I'm going to have to remain specific to this particular project, that is the Operation Warp Speed program, in which indeed one major piece of the program was funding by the federal government, by taxpayers, of not only the research process, but also the manufacturer process and support for the eventual distribution process. So there really was a clear alliance from the outset between the federal government and a certain set of biotech and pharmaceutical companies as the kind of the bets that the government was placing on who was going to provide medications for the American population. I should say vaccines for the American population. Those are actually, I think, separate from the advanced purchase agreement process, which I think is worthy of its own session as part of this series. And of course, the U.S. as well as a number of other governments in wealthy countries purchased tremendous numbers of vaccine allotments in advance. And so I think that was I would call that a complementary process to the Operation Warp Speed, which was really oriented toward R&D and approval of the vaccines.
Great, thank you. So the next question that I can see high on the votes is actually from another named person, Anne Kelly. Anne writes, I'm curious about the role of disruptions and fragilities in industrial scale biomedical production in attenuating public trust in regulatory science. In the accelerated review, manufacturing processes, e.g. quality management systems, secure supply chains, take on a greater importance to compensate for lack of evidence. Might not the waning trust in regulatory science also reflect a concern with the integrity and quality of vaccine manufacturing?
Yeah, I think there certainly is a lot of discussion about problems in the integrity of the manufacturing processes, alongside the vaccine regulation process. In the U.S., I think there's been less attention on that. There's been a lot of attention to reports of side effects, and a lot of attention, obviously, to the politicization of the regulatory process. But I think I think the point is well taken that, in this rushed emergency situation in which there's, a massive industrial ramp up of the manufacturing process, there's lots of room for public concern about whether that process is functioning properly. But again, at least in the U.S., I haven't seen that much attention paid to, the issues around vaccine production. That may be more of a problem elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Next question on the high list here is from Jack Stilgo. Can you say something else about the attempts to preserve credibility of some vaccines with a precaution response to the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines? Should precaution be seen as a response or a contributor to public uncertainty?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's actually precisely the question with which some of these these advisory committees were wrestling. I'm thinking, for example, of a very recent CDC meeting on the reports of side effects on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, in which that was the question they were asking: should we put a warning label on? Should we suspend use? Should we just say that these are very rare occasions that we don't need to worry about? But as the question suggests, I think the issue for them was as much how can we shore up trust in not just this particular vaccine, but the entire vaccine distribution and uptake process with this particular decision. So I think the attitude has been, in the EU, in the European Union and the US, has been precautionary. That is, the best thing to do would be to meet and suspend, at least temporarily suspend the use of the vaccine while evidence is reviewed. But I think the alternative case could be made that precisely that precaution actually heightens public concern about the possible side effects.
Great. Okay, this next question is anonymous. Question is, what would you say are the most important next steps, not only to course correct public trust in the available COVID vaccines, but prevent future vaccine hesitancy as well, especially considering how politically charged the pandemic has become in the US and how divisive American politics continue to be?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, my effort in the talk obviously is not to take a stand on how to improve public trust. There's this field, as I mentioned, of public risk communication, that sees its task as to demonstrate that the public should not mistrust official government and scientific expertise through practices like transparency and openness. So, what you see right now is precisely, we've had a normalization of the communication of risk at the highest levels of government since the change in political administrations from the Trump to the Biden administration. And so now we have what was much more typical in the past, which is, a CDC demonstrating, transparency and openness and clarity about uncertainties in order to, per the field of science communication, increase public trust. Now, I'm not going to recommend what CDC should do, but I will note that it's pretty striking right now, and I think distinctive in recent American history, just how politically polarized the question of trust is. And you saw that last slide I showed, in which apparently Trump supporters are quite much more vaccine hesitant, to use that term, than Democrats or independents. I think perhaps part of the conclusion is that, in fact, it is a political position that regulatory expertise should be hived off from political interference, if that makes any sense. I do not try to pretend that that science is not in any way political, and that's of course not what the Biden administration is doing.
Okay, I'm conscious the next question may be reflective of what you've just responded to. So I'm going to move to this question here. also anonymous, I think. The question is, does an anthropologist STS method focusing on public perception as related to a proper regulatory process risk not asking the real question the public and FDA scientists want to know, is the vaccine safe? Does this method of holding the scientific object at a distance risk disconnecting anthropology from the actual politics of citizen groups and scientists? What can we say about the relationship between the integrity of process and the integrity of the final vaccine? And this final question linked to that, to what extent is public trust a part of the larger medical object that is an effective vaccine campaign?
Okay, so there's a few questions embedded there.
Yeah.
Let me try to hone in on the first one, which is a kind of, has critique run out of steam question. I mean, I think STS can legitimately, hold on to its questions about how objectivity is constructed, and with confidence that that's a critical question in contemporary politics, without taking a stance with respect to the epidemiological or virological or regulatory work that's being done by government scientists and other experts. So, I see my position as analyzing these political and technical dynamics, and I think legitimately so, without necessarily believing that my role is to actually make the case for the efficacy of the vaccine. So I'm sorry, I'm only answering probably one of several questions, but people should feel free to repose some of the others as that were embedded there as they come up.
Okay. Let's see here. Yeah. Next question. Do you think public mistrust wouldn't be such an impactful factor if the political environment was less polarized?
I think there's no question that there's an interaction that's particularly striking right now between political polarization in the United States, at least, and this problematic of public trust. And it was very striking. I showed the slide of then presidential candidate Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris did this as well, sort of questioning whether indeed the public should trust a vaccine that was approved before the election. And then so at that point there was there seemed to be demonstration that Democratic voters were skeptical about the potential COVID vaccine. The election happened, obviously incredibly close. We had a transition in administration. Vaccines were released just around that time, and now we have data that that it's the political right that is suspicious of vaccine efficacy. So I think that we're, as I said at the end of the talk, we're stuck in the United States in this moment of really intense polarization in which science has been highly politicized, and it's hard to know how to find a way out of it. But I think, as the question suggests, I don't think public distrust in the vaccine would be nearly so high if there hadn't been such a politicization of all expertise at the outset of the pandemic here.
Okay, next question. We talk about integrity of regulatory, but not of integrity of evidence. The debate did occur in restricted scientific circles. Can this be part of exceptionalism built over polarizing the debate such that science becomes a non-player?
Sorry, I'm trying to parse this question.
Yeah, me too. It's the challenge.
Can this be part of exceptionalism built over polarizing the debate? So I guess I take the question to be, the extent to which science is a closed circle that might be opened up under these kinds of circumstances of exception, and that in some ways the black box of the production of data about clinical trials could potentially become part of the more public conversation. That's intriguing. I mean, there was a certain publicness about the debate over regulatory methods, for example, that I think was somewhat unusual right around the period that I was describing in October, in which the CDC external group of experts was meeting to discuss what evaluation criteria would be needed for assessing the clinical trial data. Now, the data itself was not opened up, so indeed, that remained part of a closed circle. But everybody could online attend these meetings of expert bodies. So perhaps the regulatory process seemed to, at least the relationship between external experts and the FDA was opened up a bit, but I think that the wall between public discussion and the production of clinical trial data per se maintained itself, at least in this case.
Okay, question from a slightly different perspective here. How do you think the historical abuses made in the name of research, Guatemala and Tuskegee, influence vaccine hesitancy from people of color in the US?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about this, and in some ways that was a clear object of attention from the perspective of the experts in risk communication who were worried precisely about vaccine hesitancy in the lead up to the authorization of the vaccine. So if you attended that October conference, that October meeting of experts that I just alluded to, and the discussion of the need for transparency about how the evaluation process was going to be done, a lot of the argument about hesitancy had to do with particular groups, with historical claims to having been mistreated in biomedical research, like African Americans and other indigenous groups. Now, as it has turned out from the data that I have seen, from the survey data, it actually seems that the group that is most vaccine hesitant is actually Trump supporters rather than specific minority populations in the United States with these histories. So it's, but there have been very, very intense efforts at the local level to try to build trust among those communities. And I think indeed it is doubtless the case that there's a lot of mistrust based on these prior historical experiences.
Yeah. Great. Okay, and question here from Anna W. US state and local governments are now talking about entering the ground game phase of vaccination that will be like, to quote, hand-to-hand combat to administer vaccines. Could you comment on how this may be counterproductive to public trust, especially those who are vaccine hesitant, and why these governments don't seem to have anthropologists on their teams?
That's fascinating. I had not heard the term hand-to-hand combat to describe the ground game as a kind of football metaphor, but then we get in the US we obviously naturally slide from football metaphors into combat metaphors and back. American football. So right. So is that going to be counterproductive? I mean, I guess a lot hinges on exactly what is meant by that kind of that kind of term, hand-to-hand combat. I do think that it looks like simple measures like making vaccines extremely available and easy to get, as people in hard to reach communities get to know other people, their friends, their family members who have gotten vaccinated, and hear about how easy it was to do, it seems that actually helps solve this problem. Not necessarily the problem of ideological polarization in which people are actively resistant, but the case is being made that for most people that say, I'm not sure if I'm going to get a vaccine, it's actually not active resistance, but it's a sense of, I don't need it that much, or it's hard to do. I don't know how I do it. I don't have healthcare. I'm not sure how I'm going to get access to it. So insofar as this ground game is going to work, I think it really is going to be about access and availability and a sense of ease and openness. And I hope that wouldn't increase a sense of public distrust.
You don't want to comment on the role of anthropologists or the lack of anthropologists?
Yeah, but I'm all for adding anthropologists to the government groups. We do have some medical anthropologists who at least work with and consult with CDC and with, maybe, I'm not sure if with FDA, but certainly with the CDC we have anthropologists and other social scientists playing a role.
Okay. Next question from Janice Graham, I think, here, is to what extent do you think adaptive accelerated review will continue after the pandemic, and how might this inform your exceptionality argument?
Yeah, that's, I think, pretty intriguing. Could there be an extension of what counts as an emergency? In other words, for other kinds of, and might the pharmaceutical and biotech industry start making the case that this worked fine? We should actually loosen the kind of the lengthy, detailed benefit risk evaluation process that is takes ostensibly causes this long this delay in public availability of radical treatment. So I think that's intriguing. I think that's something to watch, that with other kinds of diseases that are certainly going to be considered very serious, if there's an innovative treatment, will a drug company and patient advocacy groups make the case, wait a minute, this is an emergency too? Now it is the case that the EUA requires, so it's not easy to do, and this is part of the argument I was making about about emergency government. This method, the EUA authorization, it requires the official declaration by the Secretary of Health of a public health emergency of national security concern. So insofar as that legislative obstacle remains in place, then FDA presumably would not be able to loosen its regulatory criteria. But I think it is intriguing, the question of whether they will look back at this process and say, oh, actually, this didn't work badly in the case of the vaccines, and maybe we should adjust, or maybe we should have more flexibility as a normal part of the process.
Very interesting. Okay, a question here from Alexis. Could you comment on how the distrust on the pharmaceutical industry interacted with the distrust created by the Trump admin? What sort of new alliances were forged to secure public trust, to try to secure public trust in vaccines?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there certainly on the left there was distrust in both, and so there was a sense that that Operation Warp Speed, because it had the imprimatur of the Trump administration, even though in fact the operation came from within career FDA civil service. It was not really a product of Trump administration politics, but because it was coming in this situation of extreme volatility in the lead up, political volatility in the lead up to the election, I think there probably was a kind of overlap between worry about the pharmaceutical industry as kind of embedded in the political machinations of Washington, D.C. Now I've actually, the problem is these questions disappear, and I've lost track of the second half of the question. Sarah, do you remember what that,
yes,
where that question went?
Unfortunately, it's also disappeared for me as well. There we go. Oh, maybe at the bottom of the list. No,
so hopefully it will come back to me, but
yeah.
I think I'm agreeing with the spirit of the question.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more. The question here at the top of the list is, do you know anything about how American vaccine hesitancy and public distrust has affected other countries and the global vaccine effort as a whole, if at all, given the US's position as a major world leader?
Yeah, I'm going to have to admit to my provinciality here, and that I don't know the details of how this process has unfolded in other places. And I'm actually extremely curious to know more, because there are emergency use mechanisms, obviously in other places, including WHO and the EU. So I'm curious to know whether those came from, were modeled on the FDA process, and also curious to know whether these phenomena of vaccine distrust that you see in other countries. I've seen data on France, just as one example of that there's pretty significant levels of ostensible hesitancy there. To the extent to which those also are related to this kind of exceptionality, and to the American context, and the sense that if something murky is going on in the American in the American regulatory context, we too can't trust this, because of course the FDA has seen itself, and I think has been seen by many other government regulatory agencies as kind of the gold standard in global drug and vaccine regulation. And here it was in crisis, clearly.
We do have time for maybe one last question. Is public mistrust and vaccine hesitancy seen in other countries that have seen increasing trends toward national populism?
Right. Well, that's,
Italy, Hungary, Germany.
again,
Yeah.
I mean, another great question that I really want to know the answer to myself about the relationship between nationalism and emergency and public mistrust in these various contexts. And I think, I think the question mentioned, UK, Italy, Hungary, Germany. One could look at Brazil and elsewhere. And I would love to see that comparative analysis. But certainly in the US, nationalist populism right now is associated with vaccine hesitancy.
Andy, I think we have come to an end. We have a couple of minutes to actually talk about our speaker for next week. But can I just say thank you incredibly for this wonderful launch of our seminar series, for all the questions. We actually managed to cover a lot of ground, which I'm pleased as well. But it's been a really great start to our seminar series. Thank you so much. To say to everybody here that the forum on the webpage will be available for the next hour for further comments. So any questions that weren't asked, that you can post them there, and others are able to comment on them as well. So thank you everybody who's attended this seminar. Do come to our next seminar. I'm going to actually, first of all, thank you again, Andy, thank you so much, but also just hand over to David, who is going to introduce the speaker for next week.
Sarah, thank you very much. And Andy, thank you for a really fascinating talk. It was wonderful watching the questions coming in and seeing just how many of them seem to focus on the possibility that political polarization itself has emerged as a disease vector. So thank you again, really good to see you. Next week's speaker is Frédéric Keck, who is senior researcher at CNRS, that's France's National Center for Scientific Research. He is also director of the Laboratory for Social Anthropology in Paris and author of several books, including his highly acclaimed 2020 Avian Reservoirs, which is about virus hunters and so-called sentinel posts in China. By that, he was referring to the techniques, politics, and warning systems developed for potential epidemic outbreaks. But then after his book, along came COVID-19, leaving Frédéric really expertly positioned to comment on what he calls the Chinese crypto politics of the epidemic, and especially on how China has both focused on the development of vaccines that require less investment in the cold chain than, say, do vaccines from the US or the UK, and on how China has developed clinical trials with countries such as Brazil, which we've mentioned today, and Indonesia, in exchange for priority doses. For those of you who already know Frédéric's work, I don't need to say here that he is also extremely well versed in the history of both philosophy and anthropology, and frankly, just a pleasure to listen to. So I hope you can all join us at this time next week when Frédéric Keck will be with us to talk about stockpiling vaccines, storing viruses, the crypto politics of SARS-CoV-2. So thank you all very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure for all of us at UCL, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Sarah, back to you.
Thank you very much, David. And just to say that the link to the forum is now on the Q&A chat sequence, so please click on that, and you also should get correspondence by email about the forum that will be open for the next hour. Thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to seeing you at our next seminar next week.